So good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of committee. So I'm Will Johnston. I'm the Chief Building Official and Executive Director of Toronto Building. So what is in front of you, I'm going to run through a presentation that summarizes the report that's in front of you around our strategy for minimizing the negative impacts of residential infill construction. It's an update based on the direction that Council's already given on this matter. So one thing just before I start, I'll just provide some background. I'll give you an update on the key action items, and I'm going to speak a lot around the infill construction public notice that's there. I'm not sure why that's up.
Different input, yeah. That's for the other computer. VGA.
I hit it. It was up.
Bill, did you want to give the TO Corps presentation, and we'll let Greg do yours today? I think he'd go for the switch.
Thank you. And I'll speak about on the infill construction public notices, which is one of the items you'll need to make a decision on today. One thing, just before I start, what I would like to say is that one of the successes of this whole project is that staff have worked fairly hard, I would say, on trying to come up with a strategy to minimize the negative impacts of infill construction in built neighborhoods. And we've worked very closely with the ratepayers associations or residents associations as well as Build. And I think the positive story there is that everyone recognizes there is an issue and there's a strong willingness to come up with a solution to address the issues. So just to start off, what is residential infill? So residential infill is situations where you have a vacant piece of property where someone goes into an established neighborhood and builds a new house. It could be a new house, a duplex, semi, or triplex. It could be a situation where you have an existing home there that's being demolished and a new single-family home, duplex, triplex, or semi is being built. Or it also can be a situation where you have an existing home and they're demolishing most of it and saving about 50% of the walls in order to maintain their existing non-conforming zoning requirements. That also would be an infill project. What we also looked at is that in situations where you have an existing home that's going through fairly extensive renovations, we've included those in this as well. And so we've said if the renovations are more than 100 square meters in total floor area, we would count that as a residential infill project. The reason for that is when you look at that type of renovation, where it's that extensive, the impacts are the same for the neighbors. So just as a reminder, the strategy, how it started just as background, often what the public's faced with is when you have an infill project going into established neighborhood, it can have a lot of negative impacts for the neighborhood, and often the public's left with or faced with a situation where they're not sure where to go for help or if they have concerns about what's being built. The other thing there is that in cases, previously I would say the city was lacking a cooperative framework or a strategy in order to deal with those complaints. And so the whole idea of this strategy is to move more to a proactive approach to dealing with the problem as opposed to a reactive approach. So the strategy is divided up into what I would call three major categories. One is what can the city do to improve complaints and manage those complaints in the city? What can we do as a city and to encourage good construction practices? And what can we do to improve the communication to residents in the neighborhood so they understand what's going on? My personal view there is that if neighbors understand what is being built and what to expect, often that can reduce the anxiety and people have a better sense of what's going on, and it can actually help with things going smoother. So just in those three categories, there were a number of action items that actually supported each one of those strategies. What I can report on today is all of those action items, with the exception of the two that are shown in white, are all underway. And most of those, I would say, are at completion or nearing completion. The two outstanding matters, which we're going to talk about today, are mentioned in the report. One is the public information notice, and that requires a bylaw, and that is in front of you today to make a decision. The second is around dust control, and that will be coming back through MLS, I think in July, I think it was. It's coming forward. So I'm just going to run through the actions that have happened to date with the strategy. So one of the key components to this was us setting up a dedicated enforcement unit And the dedicated enforcement unit was set up to work citywide. It's established in North York, and it's to provide support to all of the districts across the city in order to implement this strategy. The unit has a manager, a senior inspector, and 9 building inspectors working as part of the team. One of the things that's been positive with this team is over the last year since it was set up in early 2017, they've carried out about 1,600 site visits in 2017 on infill construction. The other thing that they've been dealing with is dormant permits. So these are permits that are sitting dormant. And you may recall a number of years ago, the Auditor General had a report in front of you identifying this as an issue. And what I can report on is that the team has been very successful over the last year of actually closing about 40,000 of those open permits over the past year. Another component of this strategy was, as you're probably aware of, is in the city, it's not just Toronto Building that's dealing with residential infill sites. So there's a number of divisions across the city are dealing with it, which actually adds to the complexity for the public when they're trying to deal with sites or have concerns with them. So what we did is we set up in Toronto Building an interdivisional working group. The purpose of that working group was to come together to address this problem and come up with strategies to deal with the issue. Over the past year, the working group has really concentrated more on setting up roles and responsibility of each of the divisions with respect to managing complaints and also setting out timeframes as to responding to complaints. One of the key pieces they did do back in late summer of 2017 is they went out and did a targeted enforcement in wards of the city where there was high concentration of infill activity. That purpose was to establish a benchmark so we could get a sense as to what are the issues so that we could later come back and measure what is the effectiveness of the program. The other advantage of that targeted enforcement program was also in order for us to determine where are the problem areas in infill construction, and I believe that over time those could change. And one of the recommendations in the report is that we get direction to do this once a year so that we're constantly measuring how effective is the program, and secondly, are the issues changing so we know what areas to focus in as far as the strategy goes. So improving communication to the residents, number of things, key things happen there. The first is that Toronto Building worked with the other divisions in the city that have an interest in infill construction, along with Build and the residents associations. And what I can say is that they were very successful in producing a good neighbor guide. That guide actually is a very comprehensive guide that speaks to all of the issues that can come up during the construction of an infill project. It speaks to what the rules are, what the expectation is for the city, as well as what the consequence of non-compliance is. And this guide has been quite successful in the fact that we put it out with all of our permits that we issue, and it's on our website, and it's a very popular site that's it's often downloaded. Second piece about improving communication is looking at Toronto Building looked at what can we do to give good up-to-date information to the community and to the builders as to what's going on that site. And so what we've made public is that the status of inspections for each of these infill sites, it's now available in real time and it's online, and so anyone can go in and look at a residential infill site and see what stages of construction have been passed, failed, or not called for. At the same time, we've issued on that site, we list all of the orders that we've issued, and then the date that those orders were issued, as well as the status of those orders. So it's making all of that information transparent to the public so they can see what is going on those sites. And so that's in place already. Furthermore, for encouraging good construction practices, what we did is put our building inspectors through fairly extensive zoning training. And so if you think about the role of a building inspector, traditionally building inspectors are quite knowledgeable on the requirements of the building code, which speak to the life safety requirements of the code. If you think of what goes on in a residential infill site, most of you, probably your complaints are very seldom someone complaining about the fact that somebody only put 2 2x10 beams in the place as opposed to 3. The issues always tend to be around the nuisance issues that it's causing, as well as things like how high, it's too big, it's not built in accordance with the approved plans, or it's located in the wrong spot on the property. So building inspectors, traditionally very knowledgeable on the code requirements. The knowledge on the zoning was a bit hit and miss. And so what we did is we put all of our inspectors through an intensive training program to not to make them experts on zoning, but to bring up their knowledge so that they could better identify key issues in the field as construction's progressing. So that course that we put all of our inspectors through was a full-day course. Half of it was in the classroom. Second half of the course was in the field with their senior inspector to make sure that they understood all of those key issues with respect to zoning. One of the ways that, or probably the primary way that Toronto Building confirms that the building or the home is in accordance with the approved plans and the height and location is correct, is we require an as-built survey from a licensed land surveyor to provide that, that confirmation. In the past, that as-built survey could have come in any time during construction. What we did is changed our practice to say that once the first floor is on the house, the as-built survey must be submitted to the building inspector at that point. The purpose of that is if we know the first floor height is correct and the house is in the right location on the property, then we can have a better sense as to where things will go. And if it isn't, we're not dealing with a fully framed house or fully enclosed house and then identifying the issue that the house is too high, which sometimes has happened in the past. So what we've done there is that the building inspector, when they get their as-built survey, they're meeting with the zoning examiner who actually issued the permit for zoning, who's probably better versed in the requirements of the zoning bylaw, and together they're looking at that as-built survey to make a determination if the house is correct, if it's being built in accordance with the approved plans. The idea there is to increase the inspector's knowledge, also identify these issues much earlier in the construction process so that action can be taken sooner. We've also increased our use of ticketing as an enforcement tool. So when a building inspector issues an order, the only way to enforce that order, if the builder decides not to comply with the order, is through the courts, which is a very lengthy process. And so I'm not saying that ticketing is our first go-to move in enforcement, but where we're dealing with issues of non-compliance and we're not getting the builder's attention, we do have the ability to issue tickets as a way to get compliance. We've also set up what's called an introductory inspection. And so the purpose of this introductory inspection is to educate the permit holders, the owners, the contractors about their responsibilities, and as well as what the city's expectations and their obligations are as the construction progresses. It's a good opportunity to speak about the Good Neighbor Guide to make sure the builder and the owner understand what the expectations are in that regard and how they can be a good neighbor in order to mitigate the issues as the construction proceeds. It also is an opportunity for the building inspector to speak to the property owner and builder about the importance of closing out their permit at the end and calling for that final inspection in order to close the permit, in order to control the amount of open permits that we have. So I'm just going to run through now. This is probably the meat of the report that's in front of you, where we're asking you to make a decision on is the residential infill construction information notice. So I'm just going to run through the key components of that. So the purpose of this notice is to provide the public with clear, accessible, and useful information in order for them to know what is going on the site, hopefully so that they can resolve issues themselves. It provides key information about who the builder is, what's being built on the site, and it's used also as the gateway into the city system. So when someone's looking at that sign, it also speaks to the site that they can go to see what the inspection status is and what orders have been issued on the property. The whole idea is to foster clarity about the rules and provide better information to the public about what's going on. The intent is not to delay the construction. It's meant to actually improve the communication. And we've done this through the City of Toronto Act as opposed through the Building Code Act. So when you look at a typical infill site today, this illustration is just showing you there already is a number of signs on the site. However, the permit placard is probably the key piece of information that the public can use to see whether or not a permit's been issued and obtain that permit number so they can go and look for further information in that regard. Where the arrow is showing is that's typically a very small 8.5 by 11 sheet, and the sign that we're thinking of is a much larger sign that would go on site that would provide this key information. Looking across North America, New York City already requires this type of thing on construction sites, where it provides key information. City of Edmonton does the same thing. As you're aware, in the City of Toronto, we have the requirement for the sign for development sign that's posted already. So what this sign is it provides that key information, and it's posted on the site so that to deal with when there's a demolition as well as construction on the site. It sets out the that key information about the project itself, and the information comes into the city, into a Toronto Building before we issue the permit. And then what we would do is Toronto Building actually issues a template back to the builder that they can take to a printer in order to post the sign. So the builder's responsible for printing the sign up, installing it, and maintaining it. We would produce the template for them of the sign, and they would post that. We also are working on a web-based application in order to speed up our efficiency on producing this template. So enforcement, the information notice in the case of demolition needs to be posted 5 days prior to the start of the demolition. And for the construction phase, the sign needs to go up, or the notice needs to be posted within 5 days of construction commencing. Once the sign or the notice is installed on the site, the builder is required to submit a photograph to Toronto Building showing that the notice has been posted. And at the same time, at the first introductory inspection is an opportunity for the building inspector to confirm that the notice has been properly put on the site. We're also seeking authority to issue tickets for builders or property owners who fail to comply with the notice. And the notice is required to come down at the point where Toronto Building issues the occupancy permit. Next two illustrations are just an illustration of the infill notice sign that's required to be posted. It has two components to it. On the far right is really speaking to the site address. It speaks to who the builder is, gives the key information for the builder, gives a brief project description as well as a rendering of what the finished product should look like, has a link into the city if folks want to get further information or file complaints with Toronto Building. Also speaks to Committee of Adjustment decisions that may have been made on the site as well. On the right-hand side is just a summary of some of the key points out of the Good Neighbor Guide about how to be a good neighbor. So